India just said the quiet part out loud. Difficult to bridge the gap between the positions that countries have taken. India's Ministry of External Affairs, March 2026.
BRICS, we hold the presidency. BRICS works on the basis of consensus. As you know, in this particular ongoing conflict, there are several members of BRICS who are involved in it, and for that reason, it has been difficult to bridge the gap between the positions that countries have taken, but we continue to be engaged with all the stakeholders.
Read the Western press and you would walk away convinced BRICS is finished. You would be wrong. What it actually reveals is an architecture the G7 cannot build. A bloc that argues, disagrees, and still moves forward. No enforcement from Washington, no purity tests. Sovereign nations finding consensus in real time, while a war rages in West Asia and oil prices explode. Today, I'm going to show you why that gap is not a crack in the foundation. It is the foundation. I'm Anastasia from Think Breaks, where we follow the money, the pipelines, and the power shifts the headlines miss. Western media ran these headlines like a victory lap. BRICS is cracking, the alliance is fracturing, it's falling apart. But here is what they missed. What if that gap, that honest, messy, sovereign gap, is exactly the point? Today we will cover 4 critical BRICS developments from the past week. Number 1, the challenge of diplomatic consensus and the push to rebuild the United Nations. Number 2, energy security and the oil chokehold, how Russia is literally keeping the lights on in Cuba while the US flip-flops on its own sanctions. Number 3, economic resilience and strategic autonomy. Why India-Russia trade just hit a record $68 billion and what that means for de-dollarization. Number 4, how the global south is rebuilding its own security architecture. From Indonesia rejecting Western military logic on Iran to Brazil and Bolivia stitching together infrastructure and borders independently on Washington. Let's dive in. India holds the BRICS presidency in 2026. Chair, organizer, the nation responsible for keeping 9 very different countries moving together. Then the war in West Asia broke out, and every member formed a different opinion on what BRICS should say about it. Some members are directly involved in the conflict, some have trade ties with both sides. India's job is to find a position everyone can live with without forcing anyone to abandon their own interests. That is what the Ministry of External Affairs meant. Not failure, democratic diplomacy. The G7 looks unified because it is not really consensus, it is compliance. European governments fall in line behind US policy within days. That is not solidarity. That is subordination. BRICS operates differently. Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and India's External Affairs Minister Dr. Subramanyar Jaishankar have maintained what their joint statement called an uninterrupted and robust dialogue, including a direct call on March 11, 2026, to find mutually beneficial and acceptable solutions. Every word counts. Mutually beneficial means both sides gain. Acceptable means no one is steamrolled. It takes daily work. That work is happening now. But here is what mainstream media missed entirely. This connects directly to a larger push, a complete overhaul of the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council was designed in 1945 for a world that no longer exists. 5 permanent members hold vetoes, and as President Lula noted bluntly, those 5, the US, Russia, China, France, the UK, are often the very nations starting wars, not stopping them.
Falei com vários presidentes do Conselho de Segurança da ONU. Está na hora de vocês convocarem uma reunião, meus amigos. O Conselho de Segurança da ONU foi criado em 1945. Quem participa do Conselho foram aqueles que ganharam a Segunda Guerra Mundial. Então, é os Estados Unidos, é a Rússia, é a China, é a França e a Inglaterra. O restante do mundo não participa. Mas esses 5 senhores, que são membros efetivos do Conselho de Segurança, deveriam se reunir para não permitir guerra, para evitar que a Rússia invadisse a Ucrânia, para evitar que o Putin invadisse a Venezuela, o Trump invadisse a Venezuela, para evitar que atirasse no Irã, para evitar que invadisse o Iraque. Ou seja, eles são o Conselho de Segurança, eles têm que se preocupar em evitar a guerra.
The BRICS vision, a United Nations where the global South has a real voice. The Russia-India specially privileged strategic partnership is the working model. Equal, sovereign, no veto required. Moscow and New Delhi agree. The faster the United Nations is democratized, the better for everyone not already at the top table. The gap India is managing is not weakness. It is proof that every member's position has to be earned, not ordered. On February 28, 2026, West Asia exploded. Within days, Brent crude jumped 40% from $85 to over $119. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent unveiled a break the glass plan, lift sanctions on 130 million barrels of Russian oil and 140 million barrels of Iranian oil sitting on tankers at sea, flooding the market to cap domestic gasoline prices. Bessent admitted on the record the US would be using the Iranian barrels against the Iranians to keep the price down for the duration of the campaign.
We had a break the glass plan across the administration and at Treasury. We unsanctioned Russian oil. We knew that there were about 130 million barrels on the water, and we created supply that is beyond the Straits of Hormuz. So we anticipated this. We knew that there could be a temporary, and I want to emphasize temporary, choke point there. And there was 130 million barrels of floating storage. In the coming days, we may unsanction the Iranian oil that's on the water. It's about 140 million barrels. So depending on how you count it, that's 10 days to 2 weeks of supply that the Iranians had been pushing out. That would have all gone to China. In essence, we will be using the Iranian barrels against the Iranians to keep the price down for the next 10 or 14 days as we continue this campaign.
Using Iranian oil against Iran while bombing Iran. Western sanctions are not principled commitments. They are a spigot, on or off, based on domestic political convenience. Contrast that with BRICS energy solidarity. Cuba has had near total nationwide blackouts, zero oil imports since early January 2026. The Russian-flagged tanker Anatoly Kolodkin is crossing the Atlantic with 730,000 barrels of crude due at the Matanzas terminal around March 23rd. The Seahorse follows with 200,000 barrels of diesel. The US Southern Command says it won't have significant impact. That misses the point. Cuba now has a choice Washington doesn't want it to have. Keep negotiating with an administration that views it as a strategic liability, or integrate into the BRICS economic sphere. Before we go further, if this analysis is useful, hit subscribe. It tells the algorithm this content matters. And help us with a donation if you can. Links are in the description. While diplomats argue and tankers sail, something quieter is reshaping the global economy. The global south is cutting the financial wires that kept it dependent on Western institutions. Russia India bilateral trade hit $68.7 billion in 2024 25 financial year, a record with a target of 100 billion by 2030. Crucially, it is being settled in rubles and rupees, insulating both economies from dollar weaponization. Every nation watching gets a live masterclass in sanctions proofing. The India China dynamic is where the multipolar playbook gets sophisticated. India amended Press Note 3, opening an automatic approval channel for Chinese investments below 10% equity. China now supplies nearly 40% of India's electronics imports. The payoff: India is the world's second largest mobile phone manufacturer, output surging from $21 billion in 2014-15 to 127 billion in 24-25. Indian factories, Chinese components, Indian ownership. That is leverage, not dependency. Brazil is running the same playbook with different tools. Facing Trump's tariff hikes, Lula activated the REIG regime, 3.1 billion reais in industrial tax incentives, and directed Brazil National Development Bank to more than double commitments, putting 300 billion reais behind domestic innovation and infrastructure. The Sao Paulo Campinas rail link, the Santos Guarujá tunnel, Brazilian capital, no IMF conditions. The global south no longer needs a Western co-signature to develop. Then there is the military dimension, where the rejection of Western logic is becoming impossible to ignore. In his opening remarks at the launch of the Caravana Federativa, a traveling initiative by the Brazilian government, Lula did not hold back in his harsh criticism of the United States.
Mas a gente precisa aprender a respeitar a autodeterminação dos povos. Nós temos que aprender a respeitar a integridade territorial dos países. A gente não pode ter alguém achando que é dono do mundo e levanta de manhã, eu vou tomar a Groenlândia, eu vou tomar o canal do Panamá, eu vou tomar Cuba, eu vou tomar a Venezuela, eu vou tomar... Não é possível. Não é possível. O mundo precisa de paz e não de guerra. O mundo precisa de educação e não de guerra. O mundo precisa de comida e não de guerra.
Indonesia's President Prabowo Subianto is a retired combat general. When he says the US-Israel campaign against Iran lacks rationality, it carries weight. He argued air-based regime change cannot succeed without indiscriminate bombing, and revealed Iran's leadership feels tricked by past US negotiations, closing the diplomatic off-ramp and explaining why the escalation is so hard. On March 6th, Indonesia suspended participation in Trump's Board of Peace. The Gaza initiative Jakarta had been pressured to join after weeks of pushback from the Indonesian Ulema Council. Foreign Minister Sugiono was blunt. Attention has shifted to Iran. Indonesia is consulting Gulf partners directly. Critics have rechristened it the board of genocide. Jakarta also froze its plan to deploy 8,000 peacekeeping troops to Gaza and confirmed talks to buy Chinese fighter jets, while Prabowo states flatly Indonesia will not join any military alliance. Southeast Asia's largest economy is choosing sovereign independence. That is the BRICS value system in practice. Project forward 12 to 24 months. More Southeast Asian governments stepping out of US military arrangements. Global South positions on United Nations reform hardening into formal proposals. BRICS Plus integration deepening until the next round of Western sanctions finds far less to grip. In South America, Brazil and Bolivia signed 3 cooperation agreements during President Rodrigo Paz's first official visit to Brasilia. Power lines between Santa Cruz and Corumbá, joint tourism, and a crackdown on transnational crime across their 3,400-kilometer shared border. Paz called it a historical necessity beyond ideology. Lula put it in 3 words: food, not war. From Jakarta to the Amazon, the same logic is playing out. Build the connections, own the infrastructure, set the terms yourself. So, what does this week add up to? India held 9 sovereign nations in productive tension without a single ultimatum. Russia delivered nearly 1 million barrels of oil to a sanctioned island, while Washington quietly unsanctioned Russian crude to manage its own fuel prices. India and Russia settled $68 billion in trade without the dollar. A combat general running the world's largest Muslim-majority democracy called Washington's bombing campaign irrational, then walked out of its peace initiative. Brazil financed cross-border infrastructure with Bolivia on purely domestic terms. 5 moves, 5 different countries, 1 direction. The West reads the gap in BRICS consensus as a fracture. It isn't. A fracture is what you get when forced unity finally snaps. What India is managing is something different: the friction of genuine equals negotiating in real time. Harder, slower, and the only model that doesn't collapse the moment the hegemon holding it together loses its grip. March 2026 is not BRICS struggling. It is BRICS doing the hard work, building trade routes, power lines, manufacturing bases, and diplomatic frameworks that function without Washington's permission. The anxiety in Western capitals is not strength. It is the sound of a system that built its dominance on exclusivity, now watching the exits fill up. Thanks for watching.